no way to get the soldiers out. Luckily, some smart engineers from Wisconsin had found a way so that they could build levees system and move the boats, move the boats, move the boats. And so they were able to move this army, which could have just been trapped and lost, and another of these Confederate victories that had so plagued the Union. But this is one of my favorite of his entries, because it says, on April 27th, whiskey rationed for the first time in the Army. That sounds pretty good, right? So he was pretty happy that day anyway. And the reason was some of the stuff that I had read is about 2 days before, the Confederates had captured a lot of whiskey. And it said, and one of the captain's reports was, they came and licked us real good after having had all that whiskey. So I don't know if they were passing around whiskey to get back at the Confederates, or just to make sure that they didn't capture more whiskey. Either way, he seemed to have enjoyed the fact that he was finally given whiskey. By May 16th, they're having a battle. And it's a battle much closer to the very edge of where they started. Remember, we were told that the 14th Iowa was the first into the Red River campaign and the last out. Well, we're getting close to the last out, and much of the army's being evacuated. The 14th Iowa staying behind. And so we talked about the Battle of Yellow Bayou. And this is the battle where Lawrence is wounded. It's at the same time this quilt is being made. There's not communication going on with the sisters. They're doing their best to work on the quilt and to support the Union. Remember, I'd always wondered as a young man, why Union? And that would seem to be like an 1861 thing, not an 1864 thing. But if you think about the whole, is Lincoln going to be president or not, you kind of get the whole Union idea. Has my brother been fighting for 4 years worth something or not? Union still mattered then. It wasn't the idea of, well, we tried our best, but let's go along, half slave, half free. So the 14th Iowa begins their campaign in reserve. Where are they here?
Right.
All right. See, that's a pretty safe place for Lawrence, right? Starts off here, but then he shifts into battle. And so by the time of the end of the afternoon, when they need to stop what had happened here, other people had, either moved on, retreated. They're holding the line so that they can have the retreat and move out without any further damage. The fire was so hot and the battle so intense that the only reason it ended is because all of the sugarcane caught fire. And so that meant everybody left the battlefield. Wednesday, May 18th, 1864. We were up at daylight, crossed the bayou to get some breakfast. But at 10 o'clock, we crossed back to the opposite side, and the fight commences. It is heaviest cannonading I've ever heard for somebody who'd already been in some of the biggest battles. Pretty big deal. I'm struck on the foot with a shell and tore it all to pieces. Was taken onto the ambulance and hauled to a boat 4 miles. My leg has been amputated above the ankle and is broke above the knee. Well, today that would be a terrible injury. Today, all of our soldiers who we owe debts of gratitude to, they come home alive. And they find ways to reintegrate into the community. But we know now that that isn't a good thing to have happened. Amputations were not done with the cleanest of instruments. And not knowing much about what disease was about, you can understand that this was a tough time. So, we'll get to what happens next, but let's talk about the quilt itself. And feel free, when we're done, to take a look at it. My father said, boy, it's the first time I think I've ever seen it out of the box. So it is much bigger than we probably thought. It has turkey red, so in the red striping. The indigo blue, the striping along the bottom and some of the striping above. The denim blue with some of the stars and the outline of the stars. The cheddar yellow, that's the yellow that is the stem on the corn here. You can imagine why they'd have corn in Iowa. Okay. Figurative green, that's the green that we see in the corn as well. There's cream, and the cream is right in here. The stem as well. And then, of course, the white background, and a little bit of yellow in the flower around here. So it's a summer spread style, and I really don't know if it was meant to be just a summer style without some backing, because I believe it wasn't quite finished by the time the news of what had happened on May 18th, that the Battle of Yellow Bayou had reached Kossuth, Iowa. And so there might have one day been a plan to have a backing. And no, it wasn't signed on the back. It probably, to me, made sense that it wasn't signed because it was really a particular special quilt. The Union symbol, as I've explained, is, I think, important because of just the status of uncertainty of what was going to happen with the nation at the time. Could have been earlier, I guess, that they started the concept of the Union, but it seems that it was completed at that time and it still had much relevance. So here we have a full picture of it if we'd had it hung up here today. So you'll see, and I'm told, that there are two types of stitching. One that would be a much more basic stitching that a young girl might have learned when they first began to sew, and one a more advanced technique, and that helps me believe that it really was the two sisters of different ages who had gone ahead and put this together. So the quality for 151 years is good quality, and it's because it doesn't get used. There are some errors that will show you that there's a little patching on a couple of places, and there's a little stain there, which I don't know what it would be. So the quilt is a hand piece on whole cloth, hand stuffed. The Union lettering is actually stuffed. It's not just sewn on. There's some stuffing in there. It's hand embroidered with the multiple stitching styles that I've discussed. A muslin backing. The edges are turned together and hand stitched. It hasn't been displayed. We found out today that there's not a sleeve to display it, as so many of the beautiful quilts here have been displayed. We usually will have it displayed in our home in a frame, but it has folded up, so it's displayed differently than as you see it here today. So I'm really glad that we can have it out and let it breathe and see you all. So let's see if I can find here a couple of the... When you see this area here, I'm told that there's a little bit of rust that goes with some of the red. And that little bit of rust helps date the fabric back to the type of fabric that was being used at the time versus something that we could use here today. And there's when you see down in here, there's a couple of mistakes. And you'll see that more closely up front, where you can see that they've patched over it or that it just didn't quite fit the right way. And I think that's what gives it the character of a family putting this together and not necessarily a professional. Okay, so it's pieces and borders, whole cloth with sashing and striping appliqued onto the quilt itself. When we had it professionally reviewed, it's in excellent condition for 151 years. Some minor staining, the dry rot on the red pin, a few repairs, and while we're seeing some fading of it, it's still some pretty strong colors given its age. For example, right in here is there's a little stitching error here. This area gets patched over, so instead of having this, it's a different fabric in a patch. But you see in the Union itself, that's all that have the stuffing in it. Again, in its full glory. Up in here, there's another little patched area that, you know, who knows why, but it's there. So Lawrence, in our story, he gets shipped with his amputated leg up to St. Louis. In St. Louis, there was a place that's got some history to it in and of itself called Jefferson Barracks. And in Jefferson Barracks, there were people mustered in and out of the Civil War, and obviously it was a